Let's talk Murder Row. This is a new dungeon that's going to exist in the Season 2 pool and is one of the Midnight Dungeons. Now, thematically, this is great. It's going to have you battling through like the Undercity almost of Silvermoon, fighting against both the like kind of thieves of Murder Row as well as some of the like cult-like mobs that are going to be going on here. You're going to see a lot of demons towards the end of the dungeon. It's pretty cool. Now, for the most part, my initial impression of this dungeon was I was not a fan. I have since ran this dungeon a few more times on various tanks, and this dungeon is growing on me, but there are some things that I still don't really like. So I'm hoping just to kind of talk through that stuff in this video, as well as the things that I do like about the dungeon and the things that are working well for it. So let's start off at the start of the dungeon. That makes the most sense. So starting off, you're going to have to talk to 4 snitches to kind of give you information about the first boss. And luckily, they have made them in static locations. And this is good for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it really would suck if you were forced to pull different mobs based on where these snitches were located every week or every time you slotted the key. So having it in a consistent location means that it's easier for pugs to like have kind of set routes. It also means that like set groups can also kind of coordinate larger pulls and they don't have any kind of like variance from run to run. So that's a nice change that they've done. They've also reduced the amount of casters in this start area, like the starting area, and they've also removed the mob density. There was a few more mobs that used to exist in this dungeon beforehand until the PTR cycle, which is good because Blizzard is starting to take this approach, and we saw this in season 1, where they're really starting to pull back on. I guess the term that was coined was bolt slop. Not sure where that came. I know where it came from, but that was kind of the propaganda that was being spread early in beta, which ended up getting resolved actually, and I think in a quite nice way going into the first season. And I think Blizzard is taking the same approach, and that's where a lot of the worry came from. Was this dungeon in particular had so many casters that were really obnoxious and hard to deal with, and if it was going to stay like that, it would set a bad precedent. Now, luckily, Blizzard has done a good job at not just removing casters from the dungeon, but also reducing the amount of things that you really need to kick, which is pretty cool. So anyways, the mobs that start of this dungeon, you have a couple of casters still. They will channel at a random target, which isn't like a big deal. And you have, a couple of bleed effects that go out. You have a couple of got mobs hitting your tank. The tank has a health reduction based on a poison. So it's going to be kind of important to have a poison dispel in some capacity in this dungeon. Is it the end of the world? Not really. It just is going to suck for some tanks that can't dispel themselves. And if you don't have a dispel, like a Death Knight, a Blood Death Knight having like 15 to 30% less max health could be a problem in higher keys. But for the most part, there is going to be some type of counterplay. Now, most of the mobs you're going to see in the start of the area really only exist in the start of this area outside of like some of the succubus that you're going to have to encounter. The most important mob to not pull is going to be this bribed guard. It is or captain, guard captain something. It's on the chicken. Just look, don't pull the chicken. That's all you need to know. But you're going to start off the dungeon with a fairly large pull, which is kind of cool for lust. You can get a little bit more creative as well by like pulling down the stairs early and then pulling back up to where the first snitch is located. But the snitches are all located on your minimap, so it's pretty easy to understand where they're located. Now, this route, or this dungeon, I should say, is very W. Now, we've talked about Altar of Fangs, which has a little bit of variance that you can do in it. You also have Den of Nalarok, which has a little bit of variance, but Murder Row is one of those typical, like, you hold W, you're just going to, like, walk basically straight. You might avoid this captain, but outside of that, everything you're pulling is pretty much in a straight line, so it's going to be pretty nice for pugs. Now, there's a little bit of creativity when it comes to some skips later on. It doesn't take a lot of brain cells to do the skip, but then it's understanding, okay, well, we have to pull a side pack over here or a side pack over there, but I'll kind of come back to that. So once you talk to all 4 of the snitches, we are going to be able to approach the first boss. Now, I like every boss in this dungeon. I don't like the first boss. So let's talk about what's going on here. So this is a like fake 2-target cleave encounter. You're going to have the boss, Kystia Manaheart, I think I'm saying that right, and her worm pet Nibbles, which is just, it's funny. It's funny to hear her voice lines in this instance, yelling naughty little Nibbles and nibble on your mom or something. I don't know, some crazy shit. But this is like a fake 2-target cleave encounter because the main boss, Kystia Manaheart, she's going to start off with an 80% damage reduction. And every time you phase her by bringing Nibbles down to 20% health, Nibbles will then destabilize the boss and then also reduce that damage reduction by 20% each time. So it's going to go from 80 to 60 to 40 to 20. And then if the fight's going on that long, you probably fucked up, but then eventually the boss will be taking full damage. It should never get to that point though. So the idea is that you bring Nibbles down to 20% health. You have a nice like 12 or 15-second like burn phase of 100% increased damage, and then you continue with the fights. Now, throughout the encounter, you're going to be dodging a frontal. The boss is going to be casting like a Chaos Bolt Barrage at your tank, which looks like a Chain Lightning effect. And there is going to be random kind of like images of the boss that will appear that you either need to kick or CC. So you don't need everyone to have an interrupt. You can actually a tank and 1 DPS can carry pretty hard with the interrupt. So like Ring of Peace Leg Sweep, for example, on the Brewmaster is really, really powerful. And then literally any other DPS with a brain. So basically, you're just going to hit Nibbles, do the mechanics, and then keep phasing the boss. Now, what I don't like about this boss is the damage reduction elements. This boss, in some of the keys, depending on your DPS, could be upwards of like a 4-minute fight, which is kind of crazy for how low the key levels we're doing on beta. This is similar to what we do on well, I should say PTR, but this is similar to the levels that people test on 15s, 17s, 18s, 19s. And we saw the same thing over the course of Midnight Beta, and people ended up doing almost 23s or doing 24s and 25s. Actually, I don't even know what I'm saying. And so I wish the damage reduction either started lower or was a consistent amount. Like I wish it was always maybe just 50% reduction, and then it took double damage during the burn phase. That would be a little bit better, but it just feels really bad about how slow the fight starts and then ramps up. But as the fight is like, as the boss is taking more damage during her main intermission, like the boss, like it's already low, like it doesn't really matter. It's just a really weird fight. Mostly the damage. I don't know what they could do to make this fight better. I just don't like the main boss taking reduced damage. So like it would make sense to stack the bosses for 2-target cleave, but you're not even benefiting from 2-target cleave to burn the boss. And then it really depends. Like you want to push at the right time because the boss is taking so little damage during the main phase, during the intermission. If you don't have cooldowns, the boss doesn't really get killed all that fast. And then you're just back in the main intermission again, which is just more or less of an annoying fight. So I don't know what it is. I can't really pinpoint exactly why this fight doesn't feel great, but I'm hoping that Blizzard can maybe make some kind of adjustment. Maybe there's definitely smarter than I am. So anyways, this is the worst encounter in here. It only gets better. I think the rest of the fights are pretty phenomenal, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. So once the boss goes down, you are then going to make your way into the infamous roleplay section. So originally I thought this was a really fun kind of role play area in M0s and doing heroic dungeons. It's not so fun in a Mythic Plus when you're up against a timer, but Blizzard did state in a blue post, and their intention was to reduce the length of this role play. Now, I think it's still fun. I'm a big fan of this like little role play. So what you're going to do is you're going to kill the boss. You're going to get a disguise similar to like Court of Stars almost back in the day, if anyone remembers. And then you're going to head up into the kind of like, I don't even know, it's like a restaurant area. And you're going to get assigned different roles. You're either going to be cleaning, you're going to be a bouncer, you're going to be you're going to deliver food to different guests, or you're going to be a stripper. Now, the stripper, in my opinion, is the best role. But the idea is that you just need to perform some roles for about a minute, and then you're going to get a massive 10% damage buff and healing buff, which you'll have for a couple minutes after the fact. So once you succeed 10 stars, you'll be able to go into the next area. Now, what's unique about this part is that because you're getting a 5-star review and you're getting this massive damage buff, it's pretty common for players to actually then take all of the trash into the boss fight, which is going to make making boss guides really annoying because most players will pull the boss for you despite you not wanting to chain into the boss. But in this case, a lot of like top groups and top players will just pull everything on the boss. The tank's going to have some pretty powerful defensives available for a short period of time. You're going to have lust here, generally speaking, and you're just going to be able to rip into this boss pretty quickly. So I'm going to just kind of talk about the boss fight. The trash hits the tank kind of hard. There's a little bit of AoE damage, but then they all tend to run. They all tend to flee around 20% health or 30% health. And then you just kind of like hit them when they come back in eventually. So the idea for the second boss fight is really simple. And it's similar to like Tol Dagor third boss in a little bit of a way where you're doing like barrel management. So barrels will randomly spawn. Now, one of them is going to be infused with fell energy. And there's 2 ways to destroy the barrels. First, you can use just like the circle, the flame circles that get targeted on random players, you ideally want to break the first Fel infused barrel with that mechanic. And then Zaen will eventually leap to some random corner of the room and he'll try to do murder in a row. So he's going to try to shoot every player with his pistols. He's like an outlaw rogue. And you want to spread out breaking at least the Fel barrel, but you need to line of sight behind barrels. So you want at least, 3, 4, 5 barrels active so everyone can hide. Now, I haven't tested it, but I think as of right now, most players can hide behind one barrel. And so it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. But as you can see here, it's like really important you just want to make sure you're sitting behind the Fel barrel because when it's active, everyone's taking group damage. And that's really the fight. This is going to feel like a healer fight, I think, in my opinion, because you have just the dot from the Fel barrel, but you also have Killing Spree, which does a ton of damage to your group. And then especially when you're pulling trash on, it can be pretty hectic. But the fight's really rinse and repeat. It's essentially 3 mechanics. Flame circles go to Fel barrel, hide behind barrels when you're getting targeted by a line, and use a defensive on Killing Spree. There is a tank mechanic where he puts a healing absorb on the tank that can be dispelled with a poison effect. So this is where that poison effect comes into play here. But again, it's probably not going to matter for most tanks. So anyways, once this boss goes down, you'll be heading up to kind of the final little approach, heading up to both the third and the final boss. And now this is the part where I was most concerned about, and I was kind of excited to see what Blizzard was going to kind of cook up here. And the more I pull this area, and I've done this dungeon, I think about 5 or 6 times on the PTR so far, and I plan on testing it a fair bit more, is there's a lot of fake casts, specifically like the imps. They're going to cast Fireball, but the Fireball almost does no damage. Maybe it's not scaling, but what it feels like is it's kind of meant to just be their version of like an auto attack. So nothing really crazy. Now there are a couple of other kicks. There's these like these flares. These flares will do an enrage buff that you're going to want to make sure you are interrupting. If not, the tank's going to take a lot more damage. You have a couple of like these demon flies that'll kind of fly in and pounce on random players, but again, the damage is pretty minimal. It's just group damage at the end of the day. As long as you don't pull a million of them, no one should really die to it. As you continue heading up, you're going to run into more of these Fel guards, and you're also going to see these Corrupted Warlocks. And despite having the name Corrupted Warlock, you would think it's a caster. It doesn't really cast all that often. And so he mostly like melees the tank. He applies a pretty big absorb shield, and he does drain life on the tank, which again isn't anything crazy. I didn't really need to use defensives at all. And yeah, he applies Curse of Doom that needs to get dispelled. So there's not really, like I said, like a lot of casters in this area, unless you're going out of your way to pull more casters. Now, kind of the craziest part of this dungeon is right before the third boss. There's a mini boss called Felmaster Luxe, and he does a lot of group damage. And it's pretty scary trying to group him up with any trash. Now, again, coordinated groups and well-practiced groups will probably make it work at some point. But even on PTR, playing with some pretty good players, in my opinion, it was still rough. Now, obviously, it was like limited access to like add-ons, and obviously, practice makes perfect. But the mini boss does a giant eye beam. He does blade dance, which hits everyone, applying I think a pretty nasty bleed. So you definitely want to look out for that, especially when it's coupled with other casters and mobs. Now, the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about in this area this is another thing that I'm not a big fan of, is they've included these Fel Hunters, and these Fel Hunters, when they successfully melee the tank, that does shadow damage. And this is something that we've seen be a problem in high keys, specifically in like Nexus Point Zenith or in Algothar Academy with the battle axes. When you start to add magic damage on melee hit, some tanks really start to struggle in high keys, especially when you start including group crowd control. So a leg sweep sinks autos, and then it will have a tank falling over very, very, very quickly. So hopefully they tune it properly this season. Last season was a little unfair, but also tanks are just going to be sturdier next season just based on secondary stats. So hopefully it ends up being okay. All right, moving on to Xathuux the Annihilator. This boss is really simple, and I really like it. You're in this, when you pull the boss, you're like engrossed in this like Fel energy circle, and you have to play inside of this area. And it's pretty easy to, okay, I shouldn't say it's easy to run. You can run out of room in this section, but you also cannot. He's going to start by spawning an axe, he's going to do a frontal on the tank. Then he's going to spawn an axe. You want to DPS that down because the longer it's up, the more AoE damage it does. And then you have to spread out. Then he's going to enter an intermission where he takes 30% more damage, but also has increased attack speed. And he's going to start emitting fell energy beneath his feet that the tank is just going to want to slowly move away from, allowing melee DPS to keep uptime. Now, I can see them making this fell area grow larger. I can also see it spreading faster because right now it feels really slow. But ideally, you want to fill up less than half the room, ideally. But that fell energy will eventually disappear when he does his next intermission. So that's why the fight's not super challenging, is because while you have this like limited circle to play with, it would be interesting if it was like a tight DPS check, or maybe it would start disappearing after the third fixate. But the general idea is like when he is fixating you, just move slow, take your time, and you'll fill up maybe 40% of the room. But you don't need the entire room to work with for sure. But it'd be interesting to see a world where the room filled up a little bit faster, a little bit more. But that's more of like a sweaty, a sweaty tryhard's perspective. I'm sure most tanks will probably move the boss faster, meaning that you have less room to work with anyways. So anyways, really cool fight. I really like when damage events are scripted because it kind of allows DPS to really min-max their damage instead of like RNG damage of like random targeted abilities. I like the frontal, and I do like burn intermissions. I think most DPS do like when bosses take increased damage because it just makes them feel good when they can also line up their CDs to kind of pop off. So anyways, that's the fight. So let's move into the back half of the dungeon. So once again, lots of concern here for how some of the mobs work, but luckily they did remove many of the imps. And also the imps don't do a lot. Like yes, they cast fireball. Yes, they're a little bit annoying to group, but if you just pull some of the trash onto the imps get kind of cleaved down, and then you can pull mobs from impact to impact to impact. So this area is actually relatively chill now. The scariest thing are these Goliaths. You have to pull at least one. It's pretty common for some, okay, I shouldn't say it's common, it's PTR, what am I talking about? There is the first Goliath, you can actually like walk around the edge, but everyone has to be careful. You don't want to be hitting the flares that you're pulling, but if you're able to walk around it, that's going to save you a lot of headache. But the one that the Defiled Golem you have to end up pulling is kind of right before the final boss. Now I think this mob needs a nerf. I can't imagine pugs are going to really want to do this, and I think if you wanted to skip this one as well, you're going to have to get pretty creative with strategies, whether it's like a Night Elf skip or some kind of Warlock gate tech. And I think a lot of players will be frustrated if they're forced to pull this when they don't have a good comp or they're in pugs, and it just ends up wiping them because this mob is crazy. This pull is also pretty dangerous for the tank because you have some Fell Hunters in here, and you have 2 additional mobs that are doing some other mechanics, like mostly doing the health funnel, but also meleeing the tank. But the defiled golem is just like dodge circles, big AoE damage, and then it's kite out beams and don't walk in the poop. But again, it's really high damage in its current state. But when you're finished clearing all your trash, you're going to be heading onto a Lithiel Cinderfurry. Now, the only thing that I don't like about this is that there's a little bit of RP. Now, this can be countered just by having someone run into the boss encounter space earlier while handling that last defiled golem pack. But once the fight does get underway, it's pretty cool. I like this fight a lot. So it's going to start off by having this giant demon infernal thing fixating the tank. And it's a very slow impending walk or waddle. And your goal as a tank is to kite it out and never put it in a position where your DPS are kind of like in a rough spot. You're then going to have a ad spawn that you're going to want to try to fixate down. It's going to do a little bit of tank damage. And then you're going to have imp spawn shortly after that. And players are going to want to ideally probably stack near the tank or near the boss, just so you can have all the imps kind of grouped up. Now, there's an additional strategy where you can maybe drop them away from the boss to where you're going to be going, so you can cleave them down later once you take the lock gate. But anyways, the boss will eventually summon a lock gate to the other side of the room from where she's standing, and then she's going to take the lock gate and port across. When that happens, your group's going to want to finish off the ads. She's going to spawn a giant like fell ring of energy that's going to approach your group. And your group at some point is going to need to take the lock gate to cross that beam without taking damage. Now, there are some ways to counter this by using things like Transcendence, using things like Demonic Circle. You can bubble and just walk through it. But most of the time, you just want to take the gate. It's probably the easiest solution. And then the fight just rinses and repeats. So you're going to basically be kiting out this giant infernal the whole time. I think this is such a cool fight. Like when you think of a warlock, this is kind of what you think of. You're getting overwhelmed with their demons. You have the giant infernal that's kind of always lingering off in the distance, approaching your group, pulsing AoE damage. You have the imps that are spawning from her Hand of Gul'dan, and she's spawning like this vile fiend. So it's just a really cool fight. This is one of my favorite boss fights of this season so far. I've been having a lot of fun with it, and I'm hoping that you guys who maybe haven't played it yet or will hopefully play it in the future or have been playing it on PTR, I hope you guys also find enjoyment in this fight. But the boss will eventually go down, and if you miscount like I did in this probably clip that you're showing, you'll have to go back and pull some trash, but we were really trying to skip some of those defiled golems because those guys are fucking awesome. Anyways, that is Murder Row. I think this dungeon is really cool. I do think there's a couple of things that I'd like to see change, specifically the first boss and maybe some tuning on these defiled golems. But I think for the most part, I like to hope that players will enjoy this dungeon despite having a little bit of RP elements at the start. So anyways, let me know your thoughts down below, and I hope you guys enjoyed this little breakdown. I hope you're all staying happy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.